Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm privileged to be here before you today. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians and caretakers of the land on which we meet, and to pay respect to all elders, past and present. So today, I'd like to tell you 3 stories in the hopes that they'll speak to you. This is the first story. I'll get right into it. So, I was 16 when I learned that I was born to be a villain. At this point, I was a voracious reader of fantasy and science fiction. I'd been scolded several times in class for reading David Eddings instead of taking notes. I'd done the whole hide the novel inside the larger textbook thing. Yeah. And I was very happy. I had epic stories and interesting characters and amazing worlds to explore. I didn't feel any sort of lack. Now, this began to change on my 3rd, maybe 4th reread of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I was deep in the 3rd book, I think, reading about the histories of Numenor, with Tolkien's sonorous phrasing resonating in my mind. You know, these fair and grave lords of men, tall and gray-eyed, the fair elves with their flawless faces and graceful ways, and my 2 favorite characters, both surpassingly fair. Eowyn, the White Lady of Rohan, and Arwen Undomiel, the Even Star. So this time was different. This time I paused in my reading and I was struck with the realization that for all that I loved these characters, there was no way I could ever be like any of them. Not the Númenóreans or the elves, not Eowyn nor Arwen. I was not one of those who could have joined the Fellowship, or who could have fought with Rohan or Gondor's armies. Because I was on the other side. I was an Easterling, or I was a Southron, one of the Haradrim, one of the bad guys, the barbarians, one of the nameless, faceless villains in their dark hordes. It is not only that I was not fair. This went deeper than skin, because it was tied to history, to social politics, to where my country was and is situated in relation to the rest of the world, to cultural imperialism and language, and what decides who got to write stories that would be published and read all over the world, who got to speak and who got to be heard. You see, in the books I read, it never was me. I was never one of the heroes. At best, I was a sidekick, but most of the time, I was an exotic slave or part of the armies of evil. I belonged to the countries that were far away and thus didn't matter, to places that were uncomprehended and therefore savage and hostile, to cultures defined solely by the oppression or brutality of their people. I didn't stop reading fantasy at this point. I read on even when Daenerys Targaryen emerged to conquer the lands of Essos, and that image of her, pale and silver-haired, elevated above a sea of brown bodies, burned itself into my mind. I tried to believe that these things were coincidences, like my white friends assured me, that they meant nothing to me in the real world. I knew this to be a lie, but I swallowed it so I could keep reading the kinds of books I loved. I'll tell you now what it felt like. It was being a beggar outside a feast, nose pressed against the glass, imagining what it must be like to be seen, to gorge oneself on all that delicious food. It was hunger that would not go away. And it was acceptance that this was how the White West saw me and people like me. It was a sort of cognizance that this was the way that literature in English and indeed the rest of the world worked. And it was in the end a kind of resignation. Yeah, I was a beggar, but better to be on the outskirts of the feast than to never know that such food existed at all. Why am I telling you this? I want you to see where I'm coming from. That for me and for many others, being part of fandom, loving stories of fantasy and science fiction and horror and all the marvelous genres in between, is not a neutral or bloodless act. This comes with a price more than time or opportunity or money. And some of us pay this price more often or more painfully than others, not by choice, but by necessity. Stories can cause such harm, they make one hate one's skin, one's own people, one's own history. They can justify one's cruelty to oneself and one's fellows because, you're all less human anyway. They can say with a terrible finality, no. You cannot aspire to the same respect or dignity, much less heroism. You cannot do great things. My second story is this. I was 24 when I learned that my people understood beauty. I knew very little about my country's history before the colonizers came. The Philippines was colonized by Spain for 3 centuries. And during that time, the Spanish sought to scour all traces of pre-existing culture and tradition from my country. They did a thorough job of it. Not much survived, and of what was left, most people know very little. So my history only glanced briefly at what came before the Spanish colonial period. What came before was murky and dark. I have encountered something like that here. The untruth embedded in so many structures of terra nullius, where nothing existed before settlers came to birth Australia from this land's unwilling womb. It's a prevalent story, and one that's easy to sell. We started with nothing, we brought civilization here and built this country from the ground up. Look at this arrow of progress. So because I knew little, I grew up with a subconscious belief, and I say subconscious because, if you'd asked me directly, I would have denied it. But it clung to my spine. That my ancestors were primitive savages who knew nothing of literature or music or art. That our conquerors had elevated us to a civilized state in exchange for our land, our freedom, and our blood. Then I went with my partner to an exhibit at Ayala Museum in the Philippines called Gold of Ancestors. It featured gold pieces from pre-Hispanic times that had been excavated from all over the Philippines, and it blew everything wide open. Have you ever stood in the middle of a museum floor, hands pressed to your face, trying not to weep aloud? I have. It was intense. My assumptions of primitive savagery shattered all around me. And the depth of my ignorance hit me like a blow. How could I have thought that my ancestors had no imagination or no skill? That they had no artistry or the faintest concept of beauty? How could I have bought into the terrible idea that they were savage and ignorant? How could I have believed that before there was nothing? In that exhibit, I saw a jewelry from the 14th century that was so intricately detailed, I couldn't imagine how anyone could have done it by hand, much less at that point in time. And yet my people had. This is where my art truly began. Until this moment, I'd worked on ink drawings inspired by Japanese kimono textiles and Baroque and Rococo styles, heavily flavored with the fairy tale aesthetic of illustrators like Arthur Rackham. I did my art that way because that is what I admired and what I knew, while being conscious that it wasn't fully mine. It didn't emerge out of my roots or my history, but that was understood because my culture didn't have anything of our own that wasn't externally imposed. Or so I thought, until I saw for myself. that the otherwise was true. Because this was something that belonged fully to me, and this was something that I belonged fully to. This too was a story, because everything in that exhibit was part of a narrative that said, we were here before there was something. This spoke of artistry where I thought I'd find clumsy handiwork. It spoke of glorious existence where I'd only known void. This was a story that gave me a foundation that I could build on. And so I did. Stories can also heal us. They can close up gaping wounds we don't even know we bear. They can lift us up and say, yes, move forward. Through stories, we can reclaim histories that have been stolen from us, even if the theft happened centuries ago. And through that reclamation, we can begin to confront the trauma of generations of war and colonization and say, yes, we've inherited all this darkness, but we've inherited light too. My third story is not actually a single story, but a multitude of stories. And so I can only tell you about a few of them. And you can discover the others on your own. You probably have your own of these kinds of stories as well. Because my third telling is one about stories of revolution. In my country's history, our revolutions have been fueled by stories. I think all momentous changes are in a certain sense, but especially uprisings against entrenched power. Because how can you persuade people to fight against the current balance of power, if not by telling them a story of how things can be different, of how things have to change? Towards the end of the Spanish colonial period in the Philippines, two people told two stories. One, the artist Juan Luna, painted Spolarium, which won the highest honor in the Madrid Exposition of 1884. This story told people that Filipinos, Indios, barbarians, savages, who didn't know how to create anything before their colonial masters came to their lands, were capable of artistry that surpassed their colonizers. The second, the polymath Jose Rizal, wrote two novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. Rizal was killed for these novels. These stories so inflamed Filipinos and so angered Spanish authorities that their author faced execution by firing squad. When I first read these books, I was like a grumpy high schooler who didn't see why these books were so important or incendiary. Now, I have to pause for a spoiler alert, except it's not really a spoiler because there are no good endings in Philippine colonial history. But the spoiler is that the books both end badly, with the Filipino heroes either dying, being defeated, or being imprisoned in a tortuous rape house. The second book does involve an attempt at a revolution, but it fails horribly. So why did they matter so much? What made them spark or fan the flames of revolution? What I grew to understand was that succeeding in the fictional revolution wasn't the point. The point was that Rizal held up a mirror to the Philippines of his time and showed people their true faces. He showed the greed and cruelty of the Spanish friars. He showed the arrogance of the Spanish ruling class. He showed the indifference and incompetence of officials both in the government and in the academe. He showed the injustice of the grinding systems of society, damned if you do, damned if you don't, and you're just going to be crushed by the machine. He showed the thousand slow deaths by madness, by starvation, by imprisonment, by bullets, by suicide, that countless Filipinos died under Spanish rule. he showed the sheer impossibility of continuing to live in that world. This is why this story fanned the flames of revolution. This story told people the truth, and the sheer force of this truth drove people to act. If this is the world we live in, that story said, I will fight until this world changes. For isn't that the power of stories at their core? They change worlds. We are all here because we recognize that. We have all been transformed and shaped and molded by stories. Stories have saved us at many points in our lives. They've made us laugh and weep. They've moved us to the depths of our being. They've driven us to make difficult choices, and they've fortified us through our darkest times. For many of us, they have affirmed our existence and our right to live. We here are all children of stories. And we hold on to this now more than ever. These are terrible times for so many people all over the world. In my country, over 7,000 people have been killed in the past 9 months, all in the name of a war on drugs. And you don't need me to tell you about how terrible Australia is for so many right now, especially for refugees, for indigenous people, and for homeless people. You don't need me to tell you about the wars and the killings and the terrorism attacks all around the world, with countless people forced to flee for their lives, or people having to fight politicians who are determined to legislate them to their deaths. At this point in time, it's hard to think about what we can do in the face of so much darkness and horror. But we can act. This is the world we live in. Fight until it changes. We can fight and we can take back the stories. We can refute this overwhelming narrative of hatred and despair. In our actions, in our speech, in our connections with others, we can write our own stories. We can overwrite xenophobia and racism with a truer story that is compassion and a shared humanity. We can shout back at the blaring tale of hateful patriarchy with our defiant resolve to own our bodies and our agency. We can drown out bigotry and the countless false stories that seek to divide us from each other with our collective story, that stitch together tale within a tale of a community whose members believe that we are not free until we are all free. We can speak up and speak out for the stories stifled by oppressive structures and imbalances of power. We can say that these stories have a right to be told and to be heard. And we can tell in our daily lives the story of the person who planted themselves like a tree by the river of truth and told the overwhelming tide of falseness, no, you move. And going back to my first story, in our fanish space, as creators and fans, we can change the stories that populate our shared worlds of imagination so that they stop exacting such a toll on people's lives and hearts and don't perpetuate further harm. We can support and nourish stories of reclamation and salvation and survival, as with the Gold exhibit, to bring people who have been severed from their cultures back to themselves, to center those who have long been shunted off to the margins, to give people who have long been boxed in by toxic narratives the space and freedom to live full lives instead of stereotypes. We can make more space for stories that say, yes, go and live because your life matters. This isn't about political correctness or diversity quotas or agendas. This is about justice. Because we live in an unjust world where only certain people are allowed to tell stories, are allowed to even have stories. Shouldn't we change that? Shouldn't everyone be given the chance and the space to believe that they too can do great things? That they too can be heroes? That they exist and that they matter? We know how powerful stories can be. We've seen the difference that they can make, revealing us to ourselves so that we can act upon the truth they illuminate. So I ask that we fight, we children of story, to change the stories both within us and around us, in our homes, in our communities and societies, in the quiet spaces of our bodies. We cannot let our stories, these stories of our deeply held and rooted identities and our histories and our roots, fall silent. Silence is death, and stories support and undergird life. I'm going to end with a surprise fourth story. This is not mine. It's by Italo Calvino, towards the end of his beautiful book, Invisible Cities, where Kublai Khan is speaking out of despair. And it reads, "Already the great Khan was leafing through his atlas, over the maps of the cities that menace in nightmares and maledictions. He said, 'It is all useless if the last landing place can only be the infernal city, and it is there that, in ever-narrowing circles, the current is drawing us.'" And Marco Polo, said, "The inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is already here, the inferno where we live every day, that we form by being together. There are two ways to escape suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the inferno and become such a part of it that you no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are not inferno. Then make them endure. Give them space." That is the core of our work going forward. Make them endure. Give them space. Hold fast. Uplift your stories. Thank you so much for your time. Maraming salamat po. Mabuhay tayong lahat.
I imagine we'll probably have some audience questions for Mia, so we can go ahead and do that. We've got 25 minutes before I kick you out for lunch. So I'll give Mia back her microphone, and I'm going to walk around with this one so that we pick up the questions properly for the camera rather than you yelling at me and then me yelling to the microphone. So can we get some hands? Yes, coming down. Whoop.
You're saying there's a problem with the stories that should be being told, the stories that come out of non-white perspectives and so forth, aren't getting to readers. Okay, and there's a series of bottlenecks they have to get through. They have to get someone has to decide to write them. Someone has to decide to publish that thing that's been written. A reader has to decide to buy the book. Where is the bottleneck, do you think? What's the most important bottleneck? Which one should we be worrying about?
All of them.
You don't get to say that.
Okay, well, it's really hard to identify the one thing because, like, if I were to be asked, okay, you can name only one bottleneck, I would say the bottleneck is society. And that's not a satisfactory answer either, but it's the only true one I can give, because I can't just like say this one is the one that holds the most blame or tightness, because it's a bottleneck. Because for one thing, a writer has to decide to write these stories. But for a writer to decide to write these stories, they have to feel capable of doing so. They have to, you know, especially if you're from a marginalized background, you have to find that courage to do it, and it's freaking hard, especially in a society that makes it difficult to do so. And then an editor has to like decide to publish it, which again is freaking hard, because we grow up in a society where we favor certain types of stories over another. And then a reader has to read it, which again is, because of society, really hard, because we're also conditioned to favor or want to read or be interested only in certain kinds of stories. So I don't know, if I knew that, I would be like working to fix it right now. But all I can say is that it's the entirety of it. It's the whole thing. It's all connected. So I would say, rather than thinking of it as a bottleneck, it's more like, you know, this like, gosh, it's more like this enormous weight, enormous all-encompassing like atmosphere that's pressing down on the whole thing. And you can't identify just a single point, because it's not a single point. It's an atmosphere. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, it's a cop-out. I'm sorry.
So a number of speculative fiction artists these days use digital media, but you were saying yesterday that you use physical media a lot, and I was really struck by, in the second story you told, you gave this account of walking into an exhibition space and being surrounded by physical art objects from your culture, your ancestors, and this very tangible experience of being in this space. You ended with the words, "Let them endure, give them space," and you described this experience of being in this space with these physical objects that had endured. And I wondered if that experience with that exhibition had contributed to your choice of media and your approach to your art.
That's a really nice question. Thank you. I actually hadn't like made that connection, so thank you. I think certainly there's a certain power in physicality that you can't really get with digital media, because even though like with digital media you can print it on stuff, you can never like really say the creator's hands touched this thing that I am holding as well, and through that there's a connection between us. I'm sharing in that history. But my choice of traditional media, to be honest, is actually a bit of a self-indulgent choice. That's what I call it, because I use traditional media simply because that is what I truly love and enjoy. There's just something so incredibly like pleasurable. It is pleasure when I work with paint and just seeing the colors form in front of my hands and just being able to interact with the media in a way that I wouldn't be able to with digital art, because it's pixels. So I wish I wish that I could give you a more like deep answer, that although that is a very good point, and I will actually be more conscious of physicality and the power of physicality going forward. But the truth of the matter is, I stick stubbornly to traditional media, and I say stubbornly because it's really quite challenging. There's no undo button, and a lot of people find it easier to work with digital illustrators. But I stubbornly stick to it for the sheer sake of the joy. And in a certain sense, I guess that is also, a kind of like defiance or a reclamation of everything that tells us that we're not allowed to do things simply out of joy, but we have to make choices based on what's efficient. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? I'll start down here and then I'll work my way back. Just getting that exercise in.
Thank you.
So many steps today, man. I'm amazed.
I guess I just wanted to sort of generally ask about the emotional side of this when you talked about this shift in your perspective of that exhibition had on your own art. How could you talk a little bit about how that feels in terms of like the emotional side of things?
Yep.
And also, like,
Yep.
as opposed to
Okay, so it was very hard emotionally. Hey. Okay, so it was very hard emotionally. I was really scared for the longest time. And I was also kind of like angry at myself because why did I have to like realize this and come to this realization when it would have been so much easier to just stick to my previous style? Because, when you see that, okay, this is what you're meant to do, this is how you consciously want to develop your style as an artist, and you're doing this with purpose because there is something that you want to express. It's a really hard thing because you have to always keep thinking. And, I'm generally lazy. I don't like thinking. So I was angry because I was like, why did I have to do this? Why couldn't I just do pretty stuff and not worry about this sort of thing? Or why did I have to feel so passionate about this when it hurts? But so sometimes I still get a little like, I wouldn't say angry, but sometimes I still get a little, damn it, self, why did you have to do the hard thing? And I am always afraid. So the fear doesn't go away. Because pretty much you're writing from your gut, not writing, well, I sometimes write, but you're working from your gut. You're working from your blood. When you put things out there, it's pieces of you and your body and your history and yourself. And that never stops being scary. And obviously, especially because there have been times where I've like gotten a bit of pushback and stuff, or it's really easy for me to feel like, oh, well, these people are right. I shouldn't be insisting on this kind of thing. I should do something closer to what the market wants, stuff like that. So I also deal a lot with like nervousness. That's an emotion, right? With nervousness and having to always fight the sense that this doesn't deserve to exist, because it does. But I am aware that it's like one small thing against this huge weight and tide of like history and the oppressive structures and the remnants of colonialism and all of that stuff. So yeah, the emotions are and were mostly anger, fear, and frustration. But there is joy as well. Don't get me wrong, there is a positive thing as well, because you know that you're doing what, it's kind of like, instead of being a potted plant, you're in the ground. You know you can root as deeply as you want, and there is no limit, and you know that you're there for good. So that's the emotion. I am a tree. Thank you.
Another question. Can you hear me? I did turn it back on. Is it working? Okay, here you go.
I think you may have covered some of what I wanted to talk about. I want to thank you, first of all, for talking about the politics, but also talking about the pleasure of making art, because your art is incredibly beautiful.
Thank you.
Can you perhaps, and sorry if this is a really boring question, but can you talk about perhaps the origins of what inspired you to become an artist, how that process worked when you were young?
Yeah, actually, I really love talking about that, so it's not a boring question at all. So, my mom is a lawyer, but she's always wanted to be an artist. So from when I was very young, she was teaching me how to draw and stuff. So I think she started me drawing when I was 3. And when I was 5, she set up these like impromptu like art lessons for the children in our neighborhood in our living room. And so, you know, she bought like art materials, like used art materials from like fine art students, because at that time she was teaching in a university. So she bought these cheap discount used art supplies from fine art students, and you know, she'd put them all on the table, and usually it was just me and my 4-year-old brother there, but sometimes we had one of our neighbor kids there also, and yeah, we would make art. And you know, she actually started me on oil paints. I was 5 and she was teaching me how to do oil paints. And I actually have 2 oil paintings from when I was 5. They hang in my parents' dining room right now, and they're both of a princess. Wearing pretty clothes. Even like at that time, I was like trying to do like fine detail. So, you know, my mom taught me how to do fine detail. You put the paint on a toothpick and then you gently do that. And it had gold paint on it. So, you know, my influences, they're very clear from when I was very young. And then I kind of had to, well, the thing is, like, my mom was always like, yeah, do art. But remember, it's not a real job, okay? Don't like take it too seriously. Like, take it seriously enough to be good at it, because my mom wanted me to be good at everything I did. But don't take it so seriously that you start thinking you can make money out of it. So I was like raised to be, I don't know, a serious professional. So I wanted to be a professor. It didn't matter what field as long as I was a professor. And when I went to like university, it was like, there was a great deal of pressure because I was only 15 and I was a freshman at university. And I kind of like stopped doing art because I didn't have enough like space and time to actually do art. And at the same time, you know, my depression was hitting and too many things were happening, and like there was just no way for me to do art. So I stopped for like a very long time, so around 6 years. And then towards the end of my university, so I did start university very early, but I also stayed there for 8 years because I couldn't figure out how to graduate. And like, it was in one of my summer classes, I think it was social science or something, and I was really bored, so I was just doodling because, you know, I did stop doing like full art, but I never stopped needing my hands to always be moving. And doodling was a lot easier than taking notes. So I was doodling, and the difference was that I didn't stop with a doodle. I turned the doodle into a drawing, and the drawing became like a proper like ink piece thing, full of detail and stuff. And then when I finished it, I was like, wow, that was actually kind of fun. I'm gonna do another one. And that was how I got back into art, just by finishing a piece. And that was in 2007. And then I had my realization at the museum around 2009. And that was when I began to like seriously consider, hey, look, is this a thing that I can actually take seriously? But then I was like, oh, but I can't take it too seriously, otherwise I'll starve. And I know I didn't want to starve because I like food. So And then, like, stuff happened. I ended up migrating to Australia. I did not end up becoming a professor, which I am still very sad about. But then I found myself in a place where I didn't know what I could do to support my family. But for some reason, people, like friends, had been requesting me to do like drawings for them and paintings and say, hey, I'll pay you, just do me this painting as a gift. And so those first few friends who, actually commissioned me before I even knew what commissions were, so they got me started on this path. And then, when I got into that place where I was like, I don't know what to do, but I need to eat, maybe I can actually say, hey, I am an artist. Please pay me to do stuff for you. And to be honest, I've just been like super lucky because all the friends I've made have been super supportive, and they've been incredibly kind and patient, and they've believed in me when I didn't. And through all of that, I've been kind of developing my process to hew closer to what I want the world to see, which in recent years I've actually finally been able to articulate. And because they say that like good art, it's good if you can like express your message or like what you want the world to see in like a sentence or two. And I realized that my sentence is the fact that we, like brown people, queer people, women, exist, that we're glorious and beautiful and amazing, and that is absolutely fine, and we will eat you. So that is, that is my art journey.
A better note to end this on, to be perfectly honest. So if we can just thank Mia again for being amazing.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming, and have a happy lunch.
Go.
Yeah.
Go. Eat.